He came for a horse and nothing more. That's what he told himself anyway. A simple transaction, a way to fill the silence that had swallowed his life whole. Grief had a way of doing that. It didn't just take things from you. It hollowed you out from the inside, leaving a man-shaped echo where a soul used to be. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with Joshua Harlow. Not by a long shot. Standing in the oppressive shadow of the barn, the sun beating down on his worn hat, he heard it. It wasn't the snort of the horse he'd come for, kicking dust in the far pen. It wasn't the wind whispering secrets across the plains. It was the cry of a child. In that one heart-stopping moment, the vast, empty silence inside him shattered, and a man who thought he had nothing left to lose was about to discover just how wrong he was. The horse was a fine beast, all muscle and fury, roped tight in the pen. It thrashed against its bindings, wild-eyed and terrified. Joshua didn't even flinch. He barely blinked. The animal's panic was a distant storm, a thing he could see but not feel. Not after burying his wife, Sarah, 3 months ago. Not after standing over the cradle he'd carved with his own 2 hands. A cradle that would never hold the daughter they had prayed for. He was a man made of scars and sawdust, his face etched with lines that 40 winters had no right to put there. He knocked once on the barn's slat door. It swung open without a sound. A man stepped out, squat and sunburned, his shirt half-buttoned and clinging to his frame with sweat. He looked like he'd been dug out of the earth and left in the sun to bake. "You're late," the man grunted, his voice like gravel grinding together. Joshua didn't waste breath on an answer. Pleasantries were for men who had something pleasant to talk about. "You got the horse?" he asked, his tone as flat and dry as the ground beneath his boots. The man, Silas, jerked a thumb toward the pen. "Stubborn as a mule, but strong. She'll run for you." Joshua stepped past him, his eyes narrowing on the animal. It wasn't just fight in the horse, it was fear. A deep, gut-wrenching terror that went beyond being roped and penned. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And that's when he heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. A thud. A shuffle. And then a choked, desperate sound. The sound of someone trying to swallow a sob so no one would hear. Joshua froze, every nerve ending screaming. The barn was supposed to be empty except for the snorts of the horse and the whisper of the wind. The sound came again. Not a rat, not the groan of old wood. It was human, it was small, and it was hurting. He turned, his gaze locking onto the dark maw of the barn. "What's back there?" Silas shifted his weight, his eyes darting away. Too fast, too guilty. "Storage," he snapped. "Just old tack and junk. You're here for a horse, Harlow, not a damn tour." But Joshua was already moving. He didn't run. He walked. Each step of his worn boots on the old wooden planks was a drumbeat of purpose. Silas lunged, grabbing for his arm. "I said it ain't your concern." Joshua's hand shot up, not in a fist, but an open palm that slammed into Silas's chest with the force of a battering ram. The man stumbled back, gasping for air, shock turning his sunburned face a pasty white. Joshua didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes, cold and dark as a winter river, said everything. He pushed deeper into the barn, his nose wrinkling at the smell. It was thick, cloying. Not the familiar scent of hay and manure. This was the smell of urine, feces, and fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. Behind a stack of rotting crates, half hidden by a ripped canvas tarp, he saw it. A ladder leading up to a hayloft. But the smell was coming from beneath the floorboards. He kicked aside a loose pile of straw and saw the glint of metal. A ring, bolted to a trap door he hadn't seen. He wrenched it open. The smell that rose up was suffocating. It was a pit, a hole dug into the packed earth, and inside it, huddled in the darkness, were 2 children. He stared, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a cage. It was a grave they hadn't bothered to fill. The older one, a boy no older than 8, was crouched low, his thin arms wrapped around a smaller figure, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. She didn't even look up. just a mop of matted hair, limbs like twigs, and angry red welts on her wrists where rope had bitten into her skin. Joshua's blood ran cold. The boy's head snapped up and his eyes, sunken but blazing with defiance, locked onto Joshua's. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice a raw, trembling thing. "Don't let him shut the door again. The dark, it eats the air." Behind him, Silas cursed, his voice shaking now. "Ain't your business," he stammered, scrambling to find his footing. "They ain't yours, just leftovers. Belonged to a woman who ran up a debt. She's gone now. This is all that's left of what she owed. Leftovers." The word hung in the foul air like a disease. Joshua turned slowly, the wood groaning under his weight, his face a mask of cold fury. "You're selling them." It wasn't a question. Silas puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim some shred of authority. "Ain't illegal if no one asks." The grief inside Joshua, the hollow emptiness he'd carried for months, suddenly ignited. It wasn't hot anger. It was something colder, something far more dangerous. He looked back at the children. The boy's eyes weren't pleading. They were challenging him. "You'll walk away too," those eyes said. "They all do." Joshua reached into his coat, his hand bypassing the worn leather of his holster and finding his wallet. "What's the price?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Silas blinked, confused. "For the horse?" "No," Joshua said, his gaze never leaving the boy's defiant face. "For them." For a second, Silas looked like he might refuse. Then he let out a dry, barking laugh. "What in God's name do you want with two half-feral brats? They're more trouble than they're worth." Joshua didn't answer. He just opened his wallet and let the gold coins drop, one by one, into the dust between them. The clink of metal was the only sound, each coin a nail in the coffin of his old life. Silas stared, his greedy eyes counting, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He snorted. "Fine, take 'em. You're a fool, but you're a rich one." He tossed Joshua a ring of keys. They weren't for a lock. They were for the chains wrapped around the children's ankles. Joshua caught them midair. He swung down into the pit, the foul air making his eyes water. He knelt, his fingers trembling for the first time in what felt like a lifetime as he fumbled with the rusted shackles. The little girl he could see now flinched so hard she nearly cracked her head against the dirt wall. The boy pulled her tighter. "Don't you touch her," he warned, his voice a tiny growl. "She's mine." "I'm not here to hurt her," Joshua said, his own voice gentle, a sound he thought he'd lost forever. "Or you." The boy's jaw quivered. He didn't believe him. Why would he? "Then why did you buy us?" Joshua searched for an answer, a good one, but the truth was he didn't have one. He just knew he couldn't leave them in that hole. He knew he couldn't let the dark eat their air. The little girl's eyes opened then, slow and weary, and they were the green of new prairie grass after a hard rain. "Are you taking us away?" she whispered. Joshua could only nod. "Yes." The boy finally stood, his legs wobbling beneath him. He pulled his sister to her feet. "Then hurry," he said, his voice cracking, "before he changes his mind." They left the pit behind, but the fear came with them. It clung to them like the stench of the hole, a second skin they couldn't shed. Joshua lifted the girl into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a bundle of twigs and terror. She didn't fight him. The boy limped after them, barefoot, each step on the barn's wooden floor, a deliberate, painful act, as if he expected the ground to swallow him up again at any moment. Outside, the sun was a merciless, blinding thing. Silas was gone. Good. Joshua didn't want to test the limits of his control. He loaded the children onto his wagon without a word, covering them with a spare, dusty quilt. They huddled together, two small islands in a sea of misery. "What are your names?" he asked, as the wagon lurched forward, leaving the barn and the ghost of a horse behind. The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking to the road ahead, then back to Joshua, as if weighing the danger of a name. "Finn," he said finally, And that's my sister, June. Joshua nodded once. Joshua. He didn't offer anything more. He couldn't. Words like, "My wife is gone," and "my daughter never lived" were still lodged in his throat like shards of glass. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and June's occasional, dry cough. He watched them in the corner of his eye. June never let go of Finn's hand, not even when exhaustion dragged her into a fitful sleep. But Finn didn't sleep. Not for a second. He just watched. He watched the road, he watched the trees, and most of all he watched Joshua, his small face a mask of suspicion, waiting. He was waiting to see if this kindness, this rescue, had teeth. And if it did, when it would bite. By sundown, the sky was bruised purple and orange. They reached the ridge overlooking Dry Hill, a town so small it survived on gossip and so mean it never spared any. Joshua had land a few miles west, a homestead he and Sarah had built with their own hands. But he couldn't take them there. Not yet. That house was a tomb, filled with ghosts he wasn't ready to introduce to the living. Instead, he steered the wagon toward a line of skeletal trees by the creek, pulling up near an old abandoned smokehouse. It was leaning, but it was dry. It would do. He carried June inside and laid her gently on a pile of old, clean hay he'd gathered. Finn followed him like a shadow, his arms crossed tight against his chest, as if holding himself together. "We can sleep in the barn," the boy said, his voice hard. "Don't need to be close." Joshua didn't look at him. "It's not the barn," he said, his voice rough. "It's shelter." He lit a lantern, and the shadows danced along the crooked walls like old ghosts telling stories. June stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft and broken. Joshua's chest tightened. She was so small. A strong gust of wind could carry her away. He handed Finn a tin cup of water from his canteen. The boy drank slowly, his eyes never leaving Joshua's face. He watched him with the unnerving intensity of an old man, not a child of 8. "You going to sell us again?" he asked, the question hitting Joshua like a physical blow. Joshua froze, the cup halfway to his own lips. "No." Finn's expression didn't change. "Everyone sells us," he stated, not with self-pity, but with the grim certainty of fact. Joshua sat on an overturned crate beside him, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "I'm not everyone," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. The silence stretched between them, thick with the things they couldn't say. Then Finn whispered, so quietly Joshua almost missed it. "You smell like someone who lost something too." The words cut deeper than any accusation. They were a statement of kinship, a recognition of the same hollow space behind the eyes. Joshua didn't reply. He just tossed another log on the fire and watched the embers spit and glow, a tiny universe of dying light in the vast, unforgiving darkness. The night brought no rest. June cried out once, a sharp, terrified sound that sliced through the quiet. Joshua woke instantly, his hand flying to the revolver on his belt, before he remembered where he was. He saw her thrashing in her sleep and gently pulled the quilt back over her thin shoulders. Finn was already awake, sitting bolt upright, his small body tense and ready to fight or flee. He never seemed to close his eyes. By morning, frost had painted the windows white. The air was sharp and clean. Joshua saddled his mare, then handed Finn a coat that was far too big for him. "We're going to town," he said. "Need supplies." Finn eyed him with suspicion, pulling June behind him. "She's not going anywhere without me." "Then bring her," Joshua said. No hesitation, no argument. He would not separate them. Not for a moment. Finn blinked, a flicker of surprise in his guarded eyes, before giving a curt nod. They reached Dry Hill by noon. The streets were a mess of half-frozen mud and horse droppings. The townsfolk stared. Joshua had always been a quiet, solitary figure, a man who kept to himself even before Sarah's passing. Now, walking with 2 ragged, silent children clinging to his sides, he was a spectacle. Whispers followed them like stray dogs. He ignored them all, his focus a tight, narrow beam. Inside the general store, The warmth and the smell of coffee and cured meat seemed to belong to another world. The clerk, a portly man named Abernathy, raised a thick eyebrow when Finn, his eyes wide with hunger, reached a grimy hand for a piece of beef jerky. "Put it on my tab," Joshua said, his voice leaving no room for questions. Abernathy obliged, his eyes lingering on the children. "That your kin, Joshua?" he asked, his voice laced with a curiosity that felt like an accusation. Joshua didn't answer. He was halfway out the door when a new voice, sharp as a whip crack, cut across the street. "Harlow!" Joshua turned. A tall man stepped off the saloon porch, his coat too clean for a town like Dry Hill, a sheriff's badge gleaming on his chest like it had something to prove. This was Sheriff Boone, a man new to the territory, a man with hard eyes and a reputation for asking questions nobody wanted to answer. "Those children with you?" Boone asked, his gaze sweeping over Finn and June. Joshua's jaw set. "They are." Boone's eyes narrowed on June, who was trying to make herself invisible behind her brother's legs. "Funny thing," the sheriff said, his voice a low drawl. "Heard a rumor about a pair just like them. Went missing down south. A rancher claimed they were his property." Joshua felt Finn stiffen beside him, his small hand instinctively finding Joshua's. For the first time, Joshua didn't hesitate. He gripped it back, his large, calloused hand enveloping the boy's. The sheriff took a deliberate step forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Might be I need to ask these children some questions, alone." Joshua moved, placing himself squarely between the sheriff and the kids. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a granite boulder. "They're not his. I paid for them." Boone's brow furrowed. "Paid for them? Like livestock?" Joshua's eyes went from cold to glacial. "Like human beings that needed saving." The sheriff stared, chewing on that for a long moment. He seemed about to press the issue, to demand proof Joshua didn't have, when a sound ripped through the tense standoff. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a scream. High, ragged, and terrified, it erupted from the alley behind the saloon. A woman burst into the street, her dress torn, a dark smear of blood on her arm. "Help!" she sobbed, her eyes wild with panic. "Please, somebody help! He's still in there! He's got my boy!" Everyone on the street froze, everyone except Joshua. He shoved June into Finn's arms. "Stay with her," he commanded, his eyes locking with the boys. "Don't move." And then he ran. He didn't wait for the sheriff. He didn't wait for a posse. A child had cried in a barn once, and he hadn't acted fast enough. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The saloon doors swung wildly behind him as he disappeared into the shadows, the woman's desperate pleas echoing in his ears. He was moving toward the sound of trouble, but all he could think about was the new, terrifying weight of the two children he'd just left standing alone in the middle of a hostile street. He had to get back to them. But first, he had to go through hell. The saloon was a cave of shadows and stale air, thick with the ghost of spilled liquor and cheap cigar smoke. Joshua didn't pause at the threshold. He crossed it in 3 long strides, his boots thudding against the warped floorboards, the crunch of broken glass under his heel. The woman's screams had faded, replaced by a more chilling sound from the back room, the scuffle of a struggle, a heavy grunt of effort, and the sharp crack of wood breaking. Joshua's hand went to the revolver at his belt, the worn grip of familiar comfort. He didn't draw it. Not yet. A weapon was a last resort. Your hands, your feet, your will, those were your first line of defense. He kicked the backroom door open, the impact so hard it shook the frame, splintering the cheap pine. The scene inside was chaos. A mountain of a man, his face flushed and sweaty, had another man pinned against the bar's side wall. His fist rose and fell with a brutal rhythmic violence. The man being beaten was smaller, older, and already half unconscious, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. And behind them, huddled beneath a rickety card table, a small boy sobbed, clutching a broken toy soldier in his hand. "Enough," Joshua said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It cut through the room like a shard of ice, sharp and cold, stopping the big man's fist mid-swing. He turned, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw and bloody. A sneer curled his lips. "Ain't your business, stranger," he growled. Joshua's eyes flicked from the whimpering boy to the man slumped against the wall, then back to the brute. "You beat him half to death in front of his own kid. What for?" "He ain't his kid. He's my nephew," the big man barked, spittle flying from his lips. "And this scum, he touched him. I saw him. Don't need no law to deal with his kind." Ordinarily, Joshua might have agreed, but something was off. The fear in the boy's eyes wasn't just directed at the beaten man, it was directed at his supposed savior. Joshua looked at the boy under the table. "Is that true, son?" he asked, his voice softening just a fraction. The boy shook his head frantically, tears streaming down his face. "He's my PA," he whispered, his voice trembling. He was trying to get us away. Uncle drank too much. He always gets mean when he drinks." Joshua's blood turned cold. This wasn't justice, this was an excuse. The big man, the uncle, stepped forward, pointing a thick, sausage-like finger in Joshua's face. "You got no right to interfere in family matters." "I've got 2 children out on that street," Joshua said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "And if any man, family or not, ever raises a hand to them, I'll make sure his bones never see clean ground again." The big man's face paled, but his drunken pride wouldn't let him back down. His fists clenched. "You threatening me?" "I'm making you a promise," Joshua replied. Sheriff Boone arrived then, flanked by 2 clumsy deputies, his face a mask of weary frustration. He was always a step too slow, a reaction instead of an action. "Harlow," he sighed, taking in the scene, "I told you to stay put." "Then move faster next time," Joshua muttered, stepping aside to let the law handle the mess. He had no interest in watching them sort it out. Justice in a town like Dry Hill was a currency, and it usually went to the highest bidder. His only concern was outside. He pushed back through the saloon doors, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He half expected to find the street empty, to find Finn and June gone, swallowed up by the town's predatory silence. But they were there, exactly where he'd left them. Finn was standing impossibly tall, a small, fierce guardian with June tucked behind him, her face buried in his back. They both looked up as he approached, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "You left," Finn said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of stunned disbelief. Joshua knelt, bringing himself down to their level, ignoring the blood on his knuckles and the sting on his cheek, where the uncle's ring had grazed him. "I came back," he said, the words feeling more important than any he'd ever spoken. Finn's gaze was unwavering. "You always going to come back?" The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. It was a child's plea wrapped in a cynic's challenge. Joshua didn't have an answer, not one he could give with any certainty. The world was too big, too cruel. Promises were too easily broken, so instead of making one, he just said, "Let's go home." But as he led them back to the wagon, he had the sinking feeling he didn't really have one anymore. The house he'd built with Sarah was a monument to a life that was over. And this new life, this sudden, violent responsibility for 2 broken children, didn't have a foundation yet. It was just a handful of desperate moments strung together, and he didn't know if it would ever be strong enough to build anything on. Back at the smokehouse, the wind howled a lonely tune, rattling the loose boards and whispering through the cracks like a restless spirit. The fire did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in Joshua's bones. June had barely touched the bread and jerky he'd bought. She sat huddled in the quilt, her eyes following his every move. Finn sat cross-legged by the hearth, sharpening a stick into a crude point with one of Joshua's old knives. The boy's focus was absolute, his movements precise and angry. He was making a weapon. Joshua cleaned his rifle, the familiar ritual of oil and cloth, a small anchor in the churning sea of his thoughts. His mind wasn't on bullets or bandits. It was on what came next. You don't just pull two children out of a hole in the ground and call yourself their savior. It wasn't that simple. You had to unpack years of pain with your bare hands. You had to guide them through storms they didn't even know they were walking in. You had to earn their trust, a thing that had been beaten and sold out of them so many times they might not have any left to give. That night, the nightmares came for June. Her scream wasn't loud, but it was sharp and pure with terror. It yanked Joshua from a shallow, dreamless sleep. He found her clinging to Finn, her small body trembling so violently he thought she might shake apart. "It was dark again," she whispered, her voice ragged. He was there, the man with the dead eyes. Joshua sat with them until the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. He didn't speak. He just sat, a silent, solid presence against the encroaching darkness, letting them know they weren't alone. The next morning, the smokehouse felt smaller, the walls closing in. Joshua rose early, his body aching, and set a pot of water to boil over the fire. He was watching the flames when Finn appeared at his elbow, silent as smoke. The boy stared into the fire, his face grim. "You were going to leave her," he said, not looking up. Joshua blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Back at the barn," Finn clarified, his voice flat. "When you first found us, you looked at me. You were going to take me and leave her behind. I saw it in your eyes." The accusation was so unexpected, so wrong, that Joshua could only stare. "No," he said, his voice rough. "That's not true." "It is," Finn insisted, finally looking up. His eyes were old, too old. "You thought she was too broken. I've seen that look before." He turned and walked away, leaving Joshua speechless by the fire, the boy's words a fresh wound on his already scarred conscience. Had he hesitated? For even a fraction of a second. The thought was a venomous snake coiling in his gut. Later that day, he took them to the homestead, his land. The house stood on a low rise, its windows dark and watchful, the fence still upright, though some of the rails sagged with the memory of snow and time. He opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. It felt like waking an old friend from a long, sad sleep. June hesitated on the porch, her hand gripping Finn's so tightly her knuckles were white. "Whose house is this?" she whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the porch swing Sarah had loved, the faded welcome mat. Joshua stood behind them, a silent sentinel. "It was mine," he said, the words tasting like ash. "It can be yours now, too, if you want it." June peered up at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Are you a papa?" The question was so direct, so innocent, it knocked the wind out of him. He didn't flinch, but it cost him. "I was," he managed to say. "You can be again," she said, not as a plea but as a simple statement of fact. Then she turned and, letting go of Finn's hand, took a hesitant step inside. The house was clean but frozen in time. Sarah's sewing basket sat by the rocker, a half-finished scarf still tangled in the yarn, and in the corner of the main room, casting a long, lonely shadow, sat the cradle, the empty cradle. June walked toward it as if drawn by an invisible string. She rested her tiny, dirty hand on the smooth, carved wood. "You had a baby," she said softly. Joshua's throat worked, but no sound came out. He could only nod. "Not for long," he finally whispered, the words tearing their way out of him. Finn hovered near the door, his eyes darting from room to room, mapping out exits, assessing threats, unable to trust the quiet peace of the place. He didn't trust peace. Peace was just the quiet before the screaming started. The days that followed were a blur of hard work. There were fences to mend, a chicken coop to rebuild, a mountain of firewood to stack for the coming cold. Joshua gave the children small tasks, trying to weave them into the rhythm of the homestead, to give them a sense of purpose beyond just surviving. Finn took to the axe with a grim determination, each swing a blow against the ghosts that haunted him. June found a strange solace in the neglected garden, her small hands gentle as she pulled weeds and patted the soil, humming tunelessly when she thought no one was listening. It was a fragile peace, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river. And on the 6th night, it shattered. Joshua had ridden into Dry Hill alone for feed and supplies. He'd been gone for only a few hours. When he returned, galloping up the trail as dusk settled, he saw the front door of the house was wide open, swinging gently in the evening breeze. A lamp inside had been knocked over, its oil staining the floorboards. His heart leaped into his throat. He burst inside to find Finn slumped against the wall, a nasty gash bleeding freely down his forehead. He was breathing hard, his arms wrapped protectively around June, who was crying silently, her whole body rigid with terror. "They came!" Finn gasped, his voice tight with pain and fury. Joshua's blood ran cold. "Who?" "The men," Finn said, his eyes wild. "One of them, it was the man from the barn, Silas. He said you didn't pay enough. Said June was still his." Joshua knelt, his hands gentle as he examined the boy's head. "How many?" "2," Finn whispered. "June hid. I tried to stop them." "You did good," Joshua said, his voice thick with a rage so cold it burned. "Real good." He helped the boy to his feet, but his own hands were shaking. They hadn't just come back, they had come back for the girl. June wouldn't speak for hours. When she finally did, her voice was a tiny, broken whisper, repeating the same words over and over again. "Don't take us back. Please don't take us back." Joshua didn't sleep that night. He sat in the rocker by the front door, his rifle across his lap, the fire long since gone cold. The house was silent, but it was a loud silence, filled with the echoes of what had happened and the terrifying promise of what was to come. If they came again, there would be no talk. There would be no bargains. There would be no more coins dropped in the dust. They would not take these children from him. He had lost one family to the cruelty of fate. He would not lose this one to the cruelty of men. By morning, word of the attack had crawled its way into Dry Hill like a poison weed. Sheriff Boone came riding up the trail by noon, his horse slow and cautious, as if approaching a hornet's nest. Joshua met him on the porch, not waiting for him to speak. "You hear what happened?" Boone nodded, his face grim. He dismounted, his gaze drifting to the house where Finn and June were watching from the window. "Men like that don't just vanish, Harlow. They're part of something bigger. Been rumors for years. Girls taken from settlements down south, boys sold to mining camps up north. A whole network." "Then stop it," Joshua said, his voice flat. "I'm trying," Boone retorted, his own frustration flaring. "But it's like trying to catch smoke. No names, no faces, just whispers." "Try harder," Joshua bit back. Boone looked past him, his eyes softening for a moment as he watched June, who was clutching a small, crude doll Finn had carved for her from a piece of driftwood. "They trust you," he said quietly. "That's more than most folks get in a lifetime." "I'm not most folks," Joshua said. The sheriff reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. "Warrants," he said, handing it to Joshua. "Not for anyone we know, just descriptions, faces drawn by people who saw them for a second in the dark. Someone's got to identify them. It could take years." Joshua stared at the crude drawings. 2 of the faces were hauntingly familiar. They were the men who had been at his house last night. "I'll find them," he said, his voice a low growl. The sheriff hesitated, placing a hand on Joshua's shoulder. "Don't do something that gets you hanged, son. These men are connected. Dangerous." "If I die," Joshua said, his eyes like chips of flint, "they'll die right alongside me. So I don't plan on dying." Boone said nothing more. He just mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Joshua standing on the porch, the warrant clutched in his hand. Only then did he notice Finn standing beside him, his small face set with a fierce determination that mirrored his own. "You're going after them," Finn said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "Then I'm coming too." Joshua looked down at the boy. His face was still bruised, his lips swollen, but his spine was as straight and unbending as an iron rod. For a moment, Joshua was tempted, but he shook his head. "I need you here," he said, his voice softer than he intended. To protect her. Finn's jaw clenched, but he understood. He was a soldier now, and this was his post. Then you better come back, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Joshua nodded once. I will. But as he rode out before the first light, leaving the warm glow of the house behind, he knew they were both living on borrowed time, and promises, he knew better than anyone, were the easiest things in the world to break. He left before the sun had even thought about cresting the hills. The house was still and quiet, bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the pre-dawn. He paused at the door, watching for a moment. Finn had wedged a chair under the front knob, a trick he'd seen Joshua do. June was asleep on a pallet on the floor right beside him, her small hand resting over Finn's chest, as if she needed to feel the constant, steady rhythm of his heart to believe he was still there. Joshua didn't wake them. He just pulled a thick wool blanket a little higher over June's shoulder, then stepped out into the cold gray air. He rode hard, pushing his mare through the valley, the wind a sharp, biting thing against his cheeks. The cold burned, a familiar pain that felt like an old friend. It was a reminder that he could still feel, that the numbness hadn't consumed him entirely. Hurting was proof he was still alive. He didn't stop until Dry Hill was a forgotten memory behind him, and the land opened up into rougher country. This was a place where trails turned into whispers, and the law was just a word men used before they started shooting. The men he was hunting wouldn't be in any town. They were rats, and they'd stick to the shadows. He wasn't hunting a name on a warrant. He was hunting a trade, a sickness. By dusk, he reached a place that didn't have a name, only a reputation. A way station, an outpost tucked between nowhere and regret. It was just 3 dilapidated shacks, a single muddy trough, and a sign so faded by sun and misery it looked more like a patch of rot than painted wood. 2 tired-looking horses were tied out front. Joshua dismounted, tied his mare to a loose post, and stepped inside the largest shack without knocking. The low murmur of conversation died instantly. The room fell silent. 4 men, their faces hard and weathered, stared up at him from a game of cards. One had a puckered white scar that ran across his throat like a second smile. Another had hands that were too clean, too soft for a man in a place like this. Joshua gave a single, curt nod. I'm looking for some men, he said, his voice calm and even. The kind that trade in things they shouldn't. The scarred man leaned back in his chair, a glint of amusement in his eyes. Aren't we all, friend? This kind sells children, Joshua said. The amusement vanished. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. No one spoke. Joshua took the crumpled warrant from his pocket and laid it on the table. The hand-drawn faces were crude, but clear enough. 2 of these men paid a visit to my homestead a few nights ago, he said, his voice dropping lower. They left bleeding, but not bleeding enough. The man with the clean hands frowned. You the law? If I was, Joshua said, his eyes scanning each face, I'd have come here with more men and started shooting first. That earned him a low, dry chuckle from one of the others. The man pushed a dusty bottle and a dirty glass toward him. Joshua didn't touch it. Word is, the scarred man finally said, his voice a low rasp. They ride with a traitor. Goes by the name Lark. Real name's Darien, but nobody calls him that, not if they want to keep their tongue. Joshua's focus sharpened. Where do I find him? You don't, the man said. He moves his camp every few days. 2 days northeast from here, maybe 3. He deals in damaged stock, sells them to ranchers who want cheap hands that don't talk back, or to the mining camps where boys have a habit of disappearing. Joshua's gut twisted. What about the ones too broken to work? The man's face was grim. They're gone, he said simply. They don't get resold. Lark calls it cutting his losses. Joshua picked up the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it back into his coat. He stood to leave. If they come through here again, he said, his voice as cold as a tombstone, you tell them they made a mistake. You tell them they already picked the wrong man's house. No one tried to stop him. No one offered help. That was fine. He didn't want allies, he wanted justice. And he was beginning to realize that justice and blood were starting to look an awful lot like the same thing. He made camp that night by a dry creek bed, the stars burning like cold, distant fires in the black sky. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He leaned against his saddle, the rifle in his hands, and thought. He thought of the pit in the ground. He thought of June's terrified whisper in the dark. He thought of Finn's small hands clenched into fists, trying to fight a battle he couldn't possibly win. A rage was building inside him, but it wasn't a hot, flashing thing. It was quiet. It was steady. It was the kind of rage that didn't fade with time. It was the kind that sharpened. By morning his mare was restless beneath him, sensing the change in her rider. The land grew harsher with every mile, the earth cracked and dry as old bones, dotted with scrub brush and twisted skeletal trees. It was a land that had given up. Around midday he saw it, a thin, controlled plume of smoke rising against the pale blue sky. It wasn't a signal fire, and it wasn't a careless cook fire. It was a camp trying not to be seen. Joshua dismounted a mile out, leading his horse into a cluster of rocks and shadows. He moved low and slow, silent as a ghost, the way his father had taught him to hunt deer before the war, and the whiskey had taken him. He crept to the crest of a low ridge and looked down. The camp was larger than he'd expected. 6 tents, a large wagon near the center covered by a thick canvas tarp. But through a tear in the canvas, he saw the glint of iron bars. It was a cage on wheels, and there were children inside, 3 of them. One sat listless, staring at nothing. The other 2, a boy and a girl, clung to each other, their eyes darting around like trapped rabbits. Men lounged around the fire, their rifles nearby but not in hand. They weren't expecting trouble. Joshua counted 8 of them. 8 to 1. The odds were long. He could ride away, go get the sheriff, come back with a posse. But how many of these children would be gone by then? How many would Lark have cut his losses on? No. This ended tonight. He waited until the sky was pitch black, until the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Some of the men were asleep in their tents. Others were drinking, their voices low and gravelly. Joshua moved like smoke, circling the camp, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He watched and waited, his patience absolute. Finally, one of the sentries wandered off from the fire, heading into the darkness to relieve himself. Joshua met him in the shadows. It was quick. It was quiet. It was final. He dragged the body into the scrub brush, took the man's rifle and coat, and slipped back toward the camp. Dressed in the dead man's stink, smelling of sweat and cheap whiskey, he walked calmly toward the perimeter. He nodded once to the other sentry, who was half asleep and didn't give him a second glance. He was close now, close enough to hear the cage creak as one of the children shifted inside. It was a girl, no older than June, whispering a broken lullaby to herself. The sound tightened a knot in Joshua's chest. He slipped behind the wagon, using the stolen rifle to jam the axle, immobilizing it. Then he crouched low in the darkness and waited for the perfect moment. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then he struck. He didn't yell. He didn't announce himself. He just fired. The rifle cracked once, the sound ripping through the night. Not at a man, at the lantern hanging from the wagon. It exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil, plunging half the camp into darkness and chaos. Men shouted, scrambling for their weapons. Joshua used the confusion to dart to the cage. "Quiet," he hissed to the terrified children inside. "I'm here to get you out." One of the boys started to sob. The girl tried to speak, but her lip was split and swollen, and no sound came out. Joshua pulled a small crowbar from his belt and wedged it into the heavy padlock. He put his entire weight into it. The metal screamed in protest. The lock gave. The door squealed open. The children poured out, their bodies light with fear and malnutrition. "Run," he whispered, pointing west. Run toward that ridge. My horse is tied there. Don't stop for anything. What about you? The girl whispered, her voice raw. I'm not far behind. He turned back to the fight just as one of the men spotted him, a dark shape against the flickering fire. There, he's at the wagon. Bullets tore through the night air. Joshua rolled, ducking behind the wagon as splinters flew. The children were gone, shadows darting into the darkness, running for their lives. Two of Lark's men charged him. Joshua took one down with a clean shot to the knee. The other slammed into him, and they crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Fists flew. Joshua tasted blood, smelled the whiskey on the man's breath. He fought dirty. He fought to survive. An elbow to the throat, a knee to the groin. The man didn't get up again. Then a new voice rang out, calm and cold, cutting through the chaos. Joshua Harlow. Joshua froze. A figure stepped into the firelight. He was tall, almost elegant, wearing a coat that was too fine for this life of dust and violence. He held a silver-plated pistol, and his smile was as smooth and deadly as a razor's edge. Lark. I didn't expect you to come calling yourself, Lark said, his voice laced with a chilling amusement. Thought you'd send the sheriff, or maybe just a bullet from a mile away. This is far more personal. Joshua got to his feet, his rifle held low but ready. I figured I owed you that much. You cost me merchandise, Harlow, Lark said, his smile never faltering. Twice now. Those children, they're a debt, an investment. They're children, Joshua growled. They're unpaid, Lark hissed, his voice losing its smooth veneer for just a second. Unwanted. The world runs on currency, Harlow. Your currency was grief. Mine is flesh. Who are you to say which one is more useful? Joshua raised his rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at Lark's heart. Lark didn't even flinch. You shoot me, he said calmly, and my organization will scatter. My men will burn every town from here to the border looking for those kids. Is that what you want? To put a target on their backs for the rest of their lives? Joshua's hands were steady. His resolve was absolute. I shoot you, he said, his voice as cold and final as the grave, and they'll scatter. But they won't come looking, because they'll be too afraid that I'm still out here, waiting for them in the dark. Lark's smile finally faded. For the first time, he saw the truth in Joshua's eyes. He saw a man who had already lost everything and had absolutely nothing left to fear. Joshua pulled the trigger. The camp fell silent. Two of the remaining men, seeing their leader fall, fled into the night. The rest were either dead, wounded, or too stunned to move. Joshua didn't waste time. He gathered what weapons he could, cut the remaining horses loose to scatter them, and then poured a can of lamp oil over the empty cage. He lit it with a single match and walked away, not looking back as the flames clawed at the night sky, burning the cage and the memory of what it held to ash. He found the children huddled near the ridge, their eyes wide with terror but safe. His mare stood waiting, patient and calm. He helped them up, one by one, their small, trembling bodies a stark reminder of what was at stake. He led them back through the darkness, moving slowly, a silent shepherd guiding his broken flock. They reached his homestead just as the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky gray. Finn was on the porch. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed from watching the trail all night. When he saw Joshua appear out of the gloom with 3 more children in tow, he blinked, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. More? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Joshua dismounted, his body screaming with exhaustion and pain. He looked at Finn, then at the new children, then back at the house that was slowly, painfully, starting to feel like a home. He nodded. They didn't have anyone, he said. Finn stepped forward, his gaze moving over the new arrivals, their bruises, their split lips, their haunted eyes. He looked at the girl who couldn't stop shaking, and the boy who refused to let go of her hand. He saw himself. He saw June. He looked back at Joshua, and for the first time, there was no suspicion in his eyes. Only a weary understanding. They do now, he said. Joshua knelt beside June, who had come to the door, her own small face pale with worry. She was still asleep, her arms wrapped tight around the little straw doll Finn had made her cheek pressed against a worn blanket, as if it were the only safe thing left in the world. He didn't wake her. He just sat on the porch steps, the rifle across his knees, and watched the sky turn from gray to pale blue. But peace didn't last long in this part of the country. By mid-morning, a rider appeared on the ridge. He was riding fast. It was Sheriff Boone. Joshua stepped out to meet him, his body tensing. The sheriff reined in his horse, his face etched with a new, deeper worry. "We've got trouble, Harlow," he said, not even bothering to dismount. Killing Lark wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning. Joshua's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" "Lark had a brother," Boone said, his voice grim. "An older brother. Meaner, smarter, and more connected than Lark ever was. Word's already spreading through the territory that you're the one who pulled the trigger. He's not coming with questions, Harlow. He's coming with fire." The early spring air, once a promise of new beginnings, now felt heavy and charged. It was the kind of stillness that comes right before a lightning strike. Inside the house, there were now 6 children. They moved in silence, not the silence of peace, but the wary quiet of animals who know a predator is circling. Finn had gone back to sleeping by the door. The handle of the knife Joshua had given him a constant, reassuring weight in his hand. June never strayed more than a few feet from Joshua's side, her shoes always on, always ready to run. Joshua stood on the porch with Sheriff Boone, the 2 men like statues, their eyes fixed on the distant, empty horizon. "How many?" Joshua asked. "Scouts saw 3, maybe 4 riders," Boone replied, his voice low. "Not a gang, not yet. But that's the first wave. If Lark's brother is who I think he is, he'll test your defenses first. Then he'll send the storm. Who do you think he is?" "A ghost," Boone said, spitting into the dust. "A man named Matthew Crowley. He ran every slave ring and flesh market from here to Bitter Hollow a decade ago, before the governor sent men to clean house. They put a price on his head, but he vanished. People thought he was dead. Looks like he just put his younger brother in charge and went into the shadows." Joshua said nothing. The name didn't matter, only the intent. "You bring a deputy?" he asked. The sheriff shook his head. "They've got families, wives, kids. I didn't ask them to come." Joshua glanced at him sideways. "And you?" "My family's gone," Boone said, his voice flat, his eyes holding a pain so old it had become a part of him. "A long time ago, a daughter, taken. I still sleep better knowing men like Crowley don't get to walk away clean." The unspoken truth hung between them. This wasn't just about the law for Boone. This was personal. Joshua didn't thank him. Words were useless now. He just gave a single sharp nod and went back inside. The air in the house was thick with the smell of wood smoke and fear. Clara, the girl he'd brought back from Lark's camp, sat near the hearth, her hands gently brushing June's tangled hair. The 2 boys who had come with her, Ellis and Tom, were in the loft with Finn, using old twine to repair a sling for the woodpile. They worked in low murmurs, their voices hushed, as if they knew something terrible was coming and didn't want to wake it. "We need to move the horses," Joshua told Finn later, leading him to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and leather. "Behind the ridge, near the river bend. If they bring fire, I don't want the animals caught in it." "You think they'll bring fire?" Finn asked, his voice small but steady. "Fire, bullets, anything they can think of," Joshua said, placing a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "They're not coming to talk, Finn. They're coming to make an example of us. We just have to make sure they're the ones who end up as the cautionary tale." They spent the afternoon digging shallow trenches around the house, reinforcing the window shutters with scrap iron, and hammering a thick slab of oak across the lower half of the front door. The house he had built as a home was slowly being transformed into a fortress. He had raised these walls with Sarah, dreaming of a future filled with laughter. Now he was fortifying them against a future filled with violence, all for a family he hadn't chosen, but one he'd be damned if he'd let the world take from him. That night he sat on the porch steps, the cool metal of his rifle a familiar weight in his hands as he cleaned it with slow, practiced motions. Finn came and sat beside him, the silence comfortable between them. "You're not scared," Finn said. It wasn't a question. "I used to be," Joshua replied, not looking up from his work. "All the time. I lost a lot because of it." He glanced at the boy, his expression serious. "Fear doesn't keep you alive, Finn. It just reminds you how much you have to lose. It's what you do with it that matters." Finn nodded slowly, the words sinking in. "You think we can keep them safe? All of them?" "We can try," Joshua said. "And if we fail—" He paused, chambering around. "We don't plan on failing." The riders came at dawn. There was no warning, no battle cry, just the low, muffled thunder of hooves on the damp earth and the flicker of dark shapes moving between the trees. 4 of them, faces half covered with bandanas, hats pulled low, guns held ready. One of them held a lit torch, its flame a single angry eye in the gray morning light. Boone stepped onto the porch, his shotgun held at his hip. Joshua was right behind him, his own rifle already raised. "State your business," the sheriff called out, his voice booming across the clearing. One of the riders, a big man with a cruel laugh, spurred his horse forward. "Business? We ain't here for business. We're here to collect a debt. For Lark. Your brother took children." Joshua's voice cut through the morning air, cold and sharp. "He sold them. He beat them. He got what he earned." "That may be," the lead rider called back, his eyes glinting. "But you've got something that belonged to him. The new girl, Clara. She belongs to Mr. Crowley now. Send her out, and we might just let the rest of you live." Joshua felt a tiny hand grip his leg. He looked down. June had slipped out of the house, silent as a breath, her face pale. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please don't let them take her." He turned, lifted her small, warm body, and passed her back inside to Finn without a word. Then he stepped forward, his rifle low but ready. "She's not going anywhere." There was a beat of heavy silence. The rider spat on the ground. "Fine," he snarled. "Burn it all." The man with the torch drew back his arm, but before he could throw it, Joshua's rifle cracked once. The torch fell to the dirt. The man fell with it, a dark hole in his chest. The horses screamed, and then the world exploded into chaos. The other 3 riders charged, guns blazing. Boone's shotgun roared, and one of the riders was blasted clean out of his saddle. Joshua rolled behind the woodpile as bullets chewed at the logs, sending splinters flying. The 3rd rider made it to the porch, leaping from his horse with a savage yell, slamming into Joshua's shoulder. They went down hard, tumbling in the dirt. Joshua lost his grip on the rifle. The man was on top of him, a knife flashing in his hand. Joshua twisted, the blade slicing across his cheek, warm blood blurring his vision. He slammed his elbow into the man's temple, once, twice, a desperate, brutal rhythm. He got his hands around the man's throat and squeezed, all the grief and rage of the past months flowing into his fingers. He didn't let go until the man went limp. He scrambled to his feet, breathing hard, blood dripping from his face. The last rider, seeing his companions dead or dying, had turned tail and was fleeing back into the trees. Joshua raised his rifle, but he didn't shoot. He let him go. He was the message. He staggered back into the house. The children were huddled in a corner, crying. June ran to him, burying her face in his bloody shirt. Clara was holding her tight, her own face a mask of stoic terror. Boone came in, his shirt torn, but he was unhurt. "That'll send a message," the sheriff said, his voice grim. Joshua looked at the terrified faces of the children, at the bullet holes in the walls of his home. "Or it'll bring more," he said. They buried the bodies behind the ridge without a word. They didn't want their blood staining the land. 2 days passed in tense, watchful silence. Joshua didn't relax. He knew men like Crowley. This wasn't a defeat for him. It was an insult, and he would answer it. On the third morning, Ellis, one of the boys from Lark's camp, didn't come down from the loft. Finn found him curled in a tight ball, shaking uncontrollably. "He don't talk," Clara explained softly when Joshua went up to see him. "Not since they took him from his family. But he listens. He knows they're coming back." Joshua sat beside the boy, not touching him, just letting him know he was there. "You're safe now, son," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one is coming to take you. Not while I'm still breathing." Ellis didn't reply, but he stopped shaking and looked at him. For the first time, he looked at him, and it was enough. That night, June climbed into Joshua's lap as he sat in the rocker, her small head resting against his chest. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice muffled by his shirt. "Even after they stop coming?" Joshua looked down at the top of her head, at the child who had been thrown away like garbage and had somehow impossibly found the strength to trust again. "If you want me to," he said, his voice thick. She nodded. "I want you to be my papa." The words. He hadn't heard those words in so long. He had never expected to hear them again. They lodged in his heart like thorns, beautiful and painful all at once. "Then I will," he whispered into her hair, holding her tight. But peace, he was learning, had a very short shelf life in this world. The next morning, a letter arrived. It was tied to the leg of a half-dead crow that lay twitching on the porch. A scrap of parchment, scrolled in thick, furious ink. "You took what's mine. You killed my men. You won't see me coming next time." It was signed with a single, chilling symbol, a crow's foot, drawn in what looked like dried blood. Joshua folded the letter and dropped it into the fire, watching it curl and turn to black ash. He didn't tell the children. He didn't tell the sheriff. But that night, he doubled the traps around the perimeter, planted broken glass beneath the windowsills, and loaded every weapon he owned. Twice, because he knew now. Crowley wasn't just sending a posse. He was coming himself, and he was coming to burn their world to the ground. The land went still before it broke. That's how Joshua knew it was coming. The birds stopped singing in the early morning. The wind died, leaving the dry grass in an unnatural, frozen silence. It was a silence with weight, the kind of heavy, oppressive quiet that comes before the sky tears itself apart. He stood on the roof of the barn, a tarnished spyglass pressed to his eye, sweeping the horizon. The world was empty. Too empty. Finn climbed the ladder behind him, his steps so quiet they were barely there. "You see him?" the boy asked, his voice a low whisper. "No," Joshua muttered, lowering the glass. "But he's out there. He's watching." Down below in the yard, June was helping Clara braid colored twine into one of the horse's manes. Her small hands were gentle, but her head kept snapping up, her eyes scanning the tree line. They all did that now. Their laughter, when it came, wasn't a sound of pure joy anymore. It was an act of defiance, a sound they carved out of the fear, as if they knew that if they stopped making it, the silence would rush in and swallow them whole. Joshua had told them Crowley might come himself. He hadn't said when or how. He'd only said that they would be ready. The traps were set. The windows were reinforced. The barn was cleared, ready to serve as a final bastion if the house fell. The root cellar now had a hidden back exit, disguised by a messy pile of firewood that was really a tunnel marker. He'd done everything he could think of, but he knew, with a cold certainty in his gut, that it might not be enough. Crowley wasn't a man who fought fair. He didn't attack. He infected. The first sign was the merchant's wagon. Sheriff Boone found it on the trade trail, 3 miles east. It was tipped on its side, the canvas smoldering, the horses gone. The driver had been shot in the head, and a single tarnished silver coin had been placed in his mouth. It wasn't robbery. It was a statement. Boone rode back to the homestead, his face tight with fury. He slammed the coin down on Joshua's table. "He's not hiding anymore," the sheriff said, his voice a low growl. "He's announcing himself. This is his old marker. He used to leave them on men who crossed him." "You still think we can fight him here?" Boone asked, his gaze sweeping over the children who had gathered silently in the doorway. "We could ride, take the kids, disappear into the mountains, find a place to hide until this blows over." Joshua shook his head, his eyes fixed on the coin. "We run. He'll hunt us forever. We stand here. We might just end it." Boone didn't argue. He just picked up the coin, slipped it into his pocket, and went outside to check the perimeter. That night, Clara woke up screaming. It wasn't a nightmare scream. It was sharp, panicked, and immediate. Joshua was at her side in an instant, rifle in hand, before he even realized there was no immediate threat. She was sitting bolt upright on her cot, her eyes wide with terror, sweat slicking her face. "He was here," she gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the window. "In the window. I saw his face. He was smiling." Joshua's gut twisted. He checked the window, the ground outside. The traps were all undisturbed. There were no footprints. "No one was here, Clara," he said gently. "You were dreaming." "No," she whispered, her voice filled with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. "I saw him." He stayed by her window until morning, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness, not believing her, but not disbelieving her either. The next morning, a note was pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife. There were no tracks leading to or from it. It was as if a ghost had put it there. The message was scrawled in what looked like blood. "I see you, Harlow. I see your little orphans. I will make you watch them break." The children weren't told about the note, but they knew. The fear was a living thing in the house now. It changed them. June started carrying her doll everywhere, clutching it like a holy talisman. Finn stopped asking to help outside, instead spending his hours in the loft, sharpening stakes and watching the trails. Even Tom, the quiet boy who hadn't spoken more than 2 words since they'd found him, started rocking back and forth whenever the house got too quiet. Joshua and Boone rode out that day, following a hunch west. They found what they were looking for. Another farm, burned to the foundations. The animals had been slaughtered in their pens. There were no survivors. But on the back wall of the burnt-out house, a single handprint was smeared in soot and ash. It was the size of a child's. "He's not just sending a message anymore," Boone muttered, his face pale. "He's trying to make us question which children are ours to protect." Joshua stared at the small black handprint. "No," he said, his voice grim. "He's trying to make the children question if we'll still be here for them tomorrow." When they got back, Finn was waiting on the porch. He'd organized the other children. They were armed with sticks, old shovels, anything they could find. He'd even rigged a bell to the front gate, using a kettle and a piece of string. "We heard a whistle," Finn said, his voice tight. "Just once, out near the trees. Then it stopped." Joshua nodded, a grim pride swelling in his chest. "Good work, Finn. Keep them inside after sunset." That night, it rained. A cold, angry storm that pounded on the roof like fists and turned the yard into a slick sea of mud. Joshua sat in the main room, his rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. June had fallen asleep in his coat, which he draped over the chair. The sheriff was in the kitchen, oiling his shotgun. The house was silent, but for the storm. Then the bell rang, once, then twice. A frantic, jangling sound. Joshua was on his feet in a flash, motioning for Boone. The 2 men moved through the house like ghosts. They reached the front porch just as a brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. A small figure. A little girl. Joshua's heart hammered against his ribs. She looked no older than 7, barefoot in the mud, her dress soaked through and torn. "Who are you?" he called out, taking a cautious step forward. She didn't answer. She just lifted her head. And in the next flash of lightning, Joshua's blood ran cold. He recognized her. It was Ellis's sister, the girl from the drawing, the one Crowley had taken first years ago. Wren. "Help me," she whispered. Her voice carried on the wind. "It's a trap, Harlow," Boone hissed, raising his shotgun. But Joshua couldn't stop himself. He took another step into the rain. "Where is he? Where's Crowley?" The girl turned her head, looking back into the trees, and in the next flash of lightning, he saw them. Figures, moving through the trees, coming fast. "Get down!" Joshua yelled, firing his rifle into the darkness. Boone's shotgun roared beside him. Bullets tore through the storm. One of Crowley's men fell. Another made it to the porch, but was driven back by a brutal swing of Joshua's rifle butt. The girl, Wren, screamed and dropped to the mud. "She's real, Harlow," Boone shouted over the gunfire. "She's bleeding! It's not a ghost!" Joshua didn't hesitate. He surged forward, scooped the girl up under one arm, and dragged her back toward the house. The door slammed shut behind them, just as bullets punched through the wood, inches from Finn's head. "Basement!" Joshua ordered, his voice a raw command. "Now!" The children ran, a panicked stampede toward the root cellar. June clutched her doll. Clara helped Ellis, who had frozen at the sound of the first gunshot. They poured into the darkness below as Joshua and Boone stayed behind, reloading their weapons, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. There was only the sound of the rain. Joshua peered through a crack in the shutters. The clearing was empty. They were gone, all of them. Except for the girl. Wren sat on the rug by the fire, shivering, a puddle forming around her on the floorboards. Joshua knelt in front of her. "Where is he?" he asked again, his voice urgent. She wouldn't meet his eyes. She just rocked back and forth. "Where is Crowley?" Her eyes, dark and haunted, finally lifted to his. "He said you'd ask that," she whispered. Joshua leaned closer. What else did he say? She hesitated, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the sound of the storm. "He said he would burn your house last, after he makes you dig all the graves." The storm outside passed, but the one inside the house had just begun. Crowley's shadow lingered, a cold presence that clung to the trees and stained the mud outside Joshua's door. By morning, Wren was asleep on a cot near the hearth, curled beneath a quilt June had silently pulled over her. Her arrival had shattered the fragile sense of safety Joshua had fought so hard to build. The other children were skittish, their eyes constantly darting to the windows, starting at every creak of the floorboards. Joshua stood in the barn, the familiar scent of hay and leather doing nothing to calm the knot in his stomach. He was tying knots in a length of rope, his hands shaking with a rage he couldn't unleash. "You trust her?" Sheriff Boone asked from behind him. Joshua didn't answer right away. The rope bit into his palm. "She's a child," he said finally, his voice rough. "So were the ones Crowley broke and turned into spies before," Boone countered, his tone grim. "He uses their hope against them. He fights like a sickness, Harlow. Gets into your blood before you even realize you're dying." Joshua looked through the slats in the barn wall, his gaze fixed on the house. "She's staying," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "She's not the one we're fighting." But even as he said it, a sliver of doubt worked its way into his heart. Who was this girl now? What had years with a monster like Crowley turned her into? That afternoon, Clara approached him while he was oiling the hinges on the cellar door. "What color were your wife's eyes?" she asked, her voice soft. The question was so unexpected it threw him. He looked up, his hands still. "Brown," he said. "Dark brown, like rich earth." Clara nodded, her own eyes distant. "Mine were too, once. My mama's were green. I forget that sometimes. I think that's the worst part of it all. Not the beatings, not the hunger. It's the forgetting, the losing the pieces of who you were." Joshua didn't have an answer for that. There was no comfort he could offer for a wound that deep. The next morning, They buried another body. Not one of Crowley's men. An old prospector, found on the edge of the ridge, his rifle and boots gone. The sheriff figured he'd been used as bait, a distraction. But Joshua saw something else. The man's hands were bound behind his back. Crowley was sending another message. This is what I do to the useless. That night, Wren finally spoke her name again. She whispered it to June as they huddled by the fire. She said Crowley had promised to let her brother go if she did what he said. She said she didn't believe him, but she was too scared not to try. Joshua watched them from the table, a notepad open in front of him. He wasn't writing a letter. He was sketching layouts of the land, mapping escape routes, rethinking every inch of the homestead. It was a chessboard, and every child was a king he had to protect. "Why are you writing all that?" Finn asked, coming to stand beside him in the low light. "In case I don't make it," Joshua said without looking up. "You'll need to know how to finish the game." Finn's voice was small but fierce. "I don't want to finish it without you." Joshua reached over and gripped the boy's shoulder, his heart aching. "That's why I'm trying not to lose." But Crowley wasn't playing a game. He was waging a war of terror. The following evening, one of the horses returned alone. It was the sheriff's mount, limping toward the fence, its coat matted with blood that wasn't its own. Joshua recognized the brand on the saddle. It belonged to a rancher 2 valleys over, a good man named Miller who kept to himself. Joshua rode out at once, alone, ignoring Boone's protests. He found the Miller ranch burned to the ground. The bodies had already been buried in shallow graves, but the markers were wrong. They weren't names. They were numbers, carved crudely into the wood. 6, 5, 4. It was a countdown. He galloped back, a cold dread washing over him. He gathered the children in the main room. "You all know the way to the root cellar," he said, his voice tight. They nodded, their faces pale. "If I tell you to run, you do it. No questions, no waiting. You run until your legs give out and then you crawl. Do you understand me?" They all nodded again, all except June. She stepped forward, her small chin set in defiance. "You're not sending us away," she said. "I'm sending you to safety," he insisted. "No," she said, her voice fierce, her green eyes blazing. "You are safety." The words hit him harder than any bullet. He knelt in front of her, his heart feeling like it was going to break. "Then I'll give you every second I can," he whispered. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and for a moment he held on, feeling the impossible weight of her trust. The countdown wasn't a metaphor. The next day, a stranger arrived, not on horseback. He came on foot, his clothes clean, his hands soft, no gun in sight. He walked right up to the gate and stood there, smiling. "I have a message for Mr. Harlow," he called out. Joshua stood in the doorway, Boone behind him, shotgun cocked and steady. "Talk fast," Joshua said. The man's smile widened. "Mr. Crowley sends his regards. He wanted me to deliver an invitation. Tomorrow, at sundown, he will come himself. He says if you're still here, you and your little collection of strays will become part of the problem he needs to solve." "I was always part of the problem," Joshua said, his voice flat. The messenger chuckled. "He also said to tell the children to say their goodbyes." Joshua moved so fast the man didn't even see it coming. One punch, clean and hard. The man spun into the dust, spitting blood. "You go back and tell him," Joshua said, his voice a low, deadly snarl, "that I've been saying goodbye my whole life. And if he wants to hear it in person, he can come die on my porch." They didn't sleep that night. Every hour was spent in preparation. They were no longer just defending a home. They were preparing for a war. By late afternoon the next day, the clouds gathered again, not with rain, but with a grim, gray light that looked like morning. The first riders appeared at the edge of the field. Then more. 4 became 6. 6 became 10. By sundown, 20 of Crowley's men surrounded the homestead, a grim circle of death. Crowley himself rode at the front, dismounting with a theatrical flourish. He was a tall man, handsome in a cruel way, his smile a scar on his face. "Joshua Harlow," he called, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I must admit, I expected more fight. Instead, I find a broken-down farmer with a collection of orphans and a death wish." Joshua stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. He didn't look at the 20 men. He looked at Crowley. "You're not touching them." Crowley laughed, a cold, empty sound. "They're not yours, Harlow. You think a little bit of kindness makes them safe from the world? You think your blood matters?" "No," Joshua said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "But mine does." For a split second, a flicker of confusion crossed Crowley's face. He didn't have time to process it. The first shot didn't come from Joshua. It came from the loft of the barn. Finn. The rider to Crowley's left dropped from his saddle. The second shot came from the kitchen window. Boone. Another rider fell. Chaos erupted. Joshua rolled off the porch as a hail of bullets tore through the front of the house. The battle had begun. Crowley's men surged forward, but every foot they gained cost them. The traps held. Hidden pits swallowed horses. Shards of glass shredded boots. Joshua had soaked the outer walls of the barn in oil, and as the first torch was thrown, the whole structure went up in a sheet of flame, not destroying it, but creating a wall of fire that forced the riders inward, closer to the shed. Finn, hidden in the trees, lit the fuse. The charge Joshua had buried wasn't big enough to be lethal. It was a distraction. The explosion sent a roar across the field, and in the confusion of the smoke and fire, Joshua moved. He was a ghost, a wraith of vengeance. He tackled one man, shot another point blank. He saw Crowley, saw the man turn, his face a mask of fury. They met in the middle of the yard. Joshua's fist slammed into Crowley's jaw. Crowley struck back with the butt of his pistol. Blood flew. They grappled in the mud, two animals fighting in the dirt, until Boone's shotgun cracked again, and Crowley went still, stunned. Joshua hauled him up by the collar. "Call them off," he snarled. Crowley just smiled, blood staining his teeth. "You're still going to lose." Joshua hit him again, hard. Crowley dropped like a sack of grain. The remaining riders, their leader down, their numbers dwindling, began to retreat, melting back into the twilight. Joshua stood over Crowley's unconscious form, his chest heaving. "Next time," Boone said from behind him, "don't let him speak." Joshua nodded, then turned and walked toward the house. The children were huddled in the doorway. June didn't cry. She just opened her arms, and he pulled her into a fierce hug. For a long, breathless moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over, that they had won. But behind them, in the dirt, Matthew Crowley's eyes fluttered open, and he smiled. They didn't bury Crowley. They didn't hang him. The sheriff had wanted to put a bullet in the man's head right then and there, end the threat before he could even stir from the mud, but Joshua had shaken his head, his voice a low, determined growl. No. Instead, he ordered rope, chains, and a spare iron axle from the barn. What they built was a cage, a crude, brutal thing, bolted to the corner of the stone smokehouse, with nothing but a patch of damp earth for a floor. Crowley sat slumped inside it now, his wrists bound, his ankles chained, the smug smile wiped from his face. He didn't speak. He didn't struggle. He just watched, his eyes following Joshua's every move, as if this part, the part where he was the one in the cage, was just a temporary inconvenience. "You're sure about this, Harlow?" Boone asked, standing over the cage as the sun bled out across the horizon. "Keeping a snake like this alive?" Joshua leaned against a fence post, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Dead men don't talk," he said finally, "and I need to know how far this sickness goes." "You already know how far," Boone retorted. "You saw it with Lark. You saw it in those children's eyes." "I need to hear it from him," Joshua insisted. "I need the names." Inside the house, the victory felt hollow. The children were too quiet. Clara hadn't left Wren's side, a silent, protective shadow. Ellis still wouldn't speak. And June, who had been so fierce during the fight, had crawled into Joshua's bed in the middle of the night and curled into a tight ball. "I had a dream," she'd whispered when he came in. "What kind of dream?" he asked, stroking her hair. "You were gone," she'd said, her voice muffled by the blankets. He hadn't made a promise he couldn't keep. He hadn't told her he'd always be there. Instead, he'd said, "If I'm gone, you run. If you can't run, you fight. But you never, ever give up. Not even for me." She had simply nodded into his chest. By morning, Crowley had started to hum, a low, tuneless, unsettling sound, like a rattlesnake's warning. Joshua stood before the cage, staring in at him. "You're waiting for something," Joshua said. Crowley tilted his head, a slow, cruel grin pulling at his lips. "Always." "You've already lost," Joshua stated. "You brought 20 men, and you're the only one left. You're in a cage built by the very people you called weak." For the first time, Crowley's eyes flashed with genuine emotion. Not fear, amusement. "You think this ends with me?" he rasped, his voice raw. "You think the market for flesh lived and died with me and my brother? You fool. You killed one link in a chain that's wrapped around this entire territory. There are a dozen more like me. Richer men, smarter men. Men who wear fine suits and sit on church boards. Men who pay for what I provide." The blood drained from Joshua's face. "You want to protect them?" Crowley went on, nodding toward the house. "You can't. Not forever. Sooner or later, someone will come for them. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but a debt is a debt. And they are a debt." Joshua stepped forward, crouching just outside the bars, his voice a low growl. "I used to believe that. That no matter what you built, the world would find a way to tear it down. But you know what I learned from those children, Crowley? What's broken can still fight back. And it can win." That night, he rode out. He didn't tell Boone where he was going. He just left a note on the table. "If I'm not back in 2 days, burn the smokehouse and take them east. Don't look back." He rode to Fallen Crossing, a larger town 2 days north. He went straight to the county records office, not the church. Inside, a weary clerk looked up as he entered. Joshua slid the bloody note Crowley had left on his barn door across the desk, the one with the crow's foot symbol. "I need to know who uses this mark," he said. The clerk paled. He looked around nervously. "That's old business," he whispered. "Dangerous business." "The danger is already at my door," Joshua said. The clerk hesitated, then pulled a heavy ledger from beneath the counter. He flipped through the dusty pages. "There was a banker," he said, his voice barely audible. "A man named Weston Pike, quiet man, richer than God, owned half the freighting lines and iron shipments in the territory. He funded an orphanage out near Bitter Hollow years ago. After it burned down under mysterious circumstances, he moved his business east. Last I heard, he was setting up a new trade house, just outside Dry Hill." Joshua's stomach turned to ice. An orphanage. It wasn't just random cruelty, it was organized. It was a business. The children were laundered, shipped like cattle, and sold to men in clean clothes with shining boots who paid for silence. He rode back like a man possessed, his mind reeling. He saw smoke rising from the ridge overlooking his homestead, and his heart stopped. But it wasn't the house. It was a signal fire Boone had lit. Trouble. He galloped down the hill to find Finn standing in the doorway, his face white with panic. "He's gone," the boy said, his voice shaking. "Crowley, the cage is empty." Joshua pushed past him. The cage had been torn open, the lock smashed, but it wasn't brute force. The iron bars had been pried loose with a tool, and in the ash on the floor there was a set of small, bare footprints. "Where's Wren?" Joshua asked, his voice deadly calm. Finn's face crumpled. "She was with June this morning. Then she said she needed some air. We haven't seen her since." She let him out. She had been the key all along. Boone came running from the barn, his pistol drawn. "There are tracks on the north trail," he gasped. "Heavy ones, and small ones. He didn't ride. He's taking her with him." Joshua turned to Finn. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone until I get back. You're the man of the house now, son. Keep them safe. He rode for hours, tracking them through mud and thicket, his rage a cold, hard stone in his chest. He finally found them in a clearing by the riverbed. Wren was sitting on a fallen log, her head in her hands, sobbing. Crowley stood over her, breathing hard, a bloody gash on his face from where she must have fought back during the escape. You should have run farther, Joshua said, stepping out of the trees, his rifle leveled. Crowley spun around, a sneer on his face as he drew his pistol. You just don't know when to die, do you, farmer? I'm giving you one last choice, Joshua said. Surrender, face a trial. There ain't a court in this territory that would convict me. Crowley laughed. No, Joshua said, his eyes as cold as the grave. But I will. Crowley fired, but Joshua was faster. One shot, clean and final. Crowley dropped into the mud, his eyes wide with surprise. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Joshua walked over to Wren, who was staring at Crowley's body, her face a mess of confusion and grief. I thought he was all I had left, she whispered. He said he was my only family. Joshua knelt in front of her. He wasn't your family, he said gently. He was your cage. Your family is back at the house waiting for you. He helped her to her feet, and together they started the long walk back. The storm was finally over, but justice had only just begun. They buried Crowley in an unmarked grave. There was no prayer, no stone, just dirt and silence. Wren didn't speak for days after they returned, and the other children watched her with a mixture of fear and pity. Trust, once shattered, was a hard thing to piece back together. But Joshua didn't give up on her. He didn't give up on any of them. Weeks turned into months. They mended the fences. They rebuilt the barn. Slowly, the house began to fill with something other than fear. It started to fill with hesitant laughter. June started smiling again. Even Ellis began to speak, quiet words of thanks as he helped Joshua plant spring potatoes. Then, strangers began to arrive. Not men with guns, but families. A woman with a haunted look in her eyes. A young boy at her side. A man with scars on his back who couldn't sleep through the night. They were the other survivors of Crowley's network, people set adrift after the chain was broken, drawn to the homestead by whispers of a safe place. A place run by a man who understood. Joshua opened the door to every one of them. He offered them food, shelter, and something they hadn't had in a long time. A choice. They could stay and heal, or he would give them the supplies they needed to start a new life elsewhere. Most of them stayed. One evening, as Joshua sat on the porch watching the sunset, a fancy carriage pulled up the trail. A well-dressed man stepped out. It was Weston Pike, the banker. He had come to see the man who had destroyed his enterprise. "You've cost me a fortune, Mr. Harlow," Pike said, his voice smooth and cold. "And you cost them their childhoods," Joshua replied, gesturing to the children playing in the yard. Pike sneered. "They were nothing. Commodities." "They are everything," Joshua said. And behind him, Sheriff Boone stepped out of the house, along with 2 federal marshals he'd ridden for days to bring back. Pike's face went white. The world outside hadn't changed. It was still a hard, unforgiving place. But inside the fences of this small homestead, something new had taken root. They weren't just survivors anymore. They weren't just orphans. They were a family. A strange, scarred, and fiercely protective family, forged in fire and fear. And Joshua Harlow, the man who had come looking for nothing more than a horse, had found everything that mattered. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a promise. A promise that even in the darkest of nights, a single light could hold back the shadows. A promise that what was broken could not only be mended, but could be made stronger than ever before. If you believe that even one person can make a world of difference, and that the fight for justice is always worth it, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. Because there are always more stories of darkness being pushed back by the light. and we'll be here to share them.